Good day, everyone. This is French. I am part of the PIDC AdCore, and this is the second of the PIDC lecture series. I want to talk about Mindanao and the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region for Muslim Mindanao. I first want to introduce myself and why I'm talking about Mindanao. I'm originally from Glan, Sarangani, that's the tip of Mindanao, but I also work in the area, regions of Maguindanao and Sultan Kudarat, and I also do research focusing on women, peace, and security. Currently, I'm also living in Davao City. So I figured this is a way to give light to realities of Mindanao, which we often talk about in debate rounds. So I hope that you can pick up one or two things in this lecture. The outline of this discussion is generally just a brief history of Mindanao. The next would be the identity formation of Mindanao. We have peace and security and politics perspective, and then the economic perspective. So first off on history, I think it's important to do this in timeline. During the pre-colonial Mindanao, I think that Mindanao is characterized by a vast majority of ethno-linguistic groups, which we collectively know now as the Lumads. So these are groups such as the Manobo, the Tiboli, or the Blaans, each with their own distinct cultures and distinct characteristics. Then there also is a process of the Islamization that happened at around 10th to 12th century. So there were a lot of Arab traders who had visited islands and bringing them Islam and their evangelization. So there are also Christianized indigenous people like the Chavacano speakers in Zamboanga. Several accounts would suggest that these group of people are the native inhabitants in the indigenous people of Mindanao. And it's important to distinguish this because later on we will talk about the process of settlements, which affected a lot of the development of Mindanao. And then it's also important to point out that the Mindanao society is during the pre-colonial era, specifically the Muslim Mindanao, was already organized socially and politically. And these are often associated with sultanates, which are quasi-states that are also recognized within their own territory, engage and in exchange with multiple actors within that specific timeline. So these sultanates often operate through lineages and kinships, meaning associated with their families. And this is for the reason why most relationships are heavily clanist. I will also be expounding on this later and how this adapts to the modern political systems in Mindanao. But also, the wealth of the sultanates are also based on their trade with China and the Middle East. So other accounts also suggest that Chinese settlements came as early even before the Spanish and American colonizations. There's already an interaction within this sultanate. So outside of the perception that Mindanao pre-colonially was under-civilized, there's already a civilization and even an interaction within communities to external entities as well. And then we have Spanish colonization. Spain eventually established their footholds in northern and eastern Mindanao and the Zamboanga Peninsula. That's why we have Christianized indigenous peoples as well. Its armies, however, failed to colonize the rest of Mindanao. That's why virtually you hear the common assumption that Mindanao was never colonized in the first place, especially those territories that were occupied by Islamized people. And the term Moro only came from the Spaniards after the Moors of Spain, which were the North African and Arab Muslim peoples. That was only a term coined by Spain themselves, but these generally in the modern world often have been referred to Islamized communities. So there was a lot of tactics that had happened during the Spanish colonization, one of which was using Christians of the north to battle against the Moros. There is also a strategy of befriending some Moro rulers to subjugate the more defiant rulers who are unwilling to to make contact with them. But there's also a strategy of undermining the economic base of these sultanates through blockades and even through wars. And then after the Spanish colonization and after the Spanish American War, we all know that it concluded with the Treaty of Paris. Between the 1913 and the 1917, when Mindanao was ceded to the American colonial power, there was massive agricultural colonies that were opened to assimilate into Mindanaoan territories. So there were a lot of Christian settlers that were mixed with indigenous and Muslim communities, purposely to promote quote unquote good working relations between the two groups, but ultimately just to mellow down the defiance of these communities against the colonial power. There was also an imposed land loss against the local inhabitants, which just introduced complex land laws that allowed them to land grab against native inhabitants. So I want to talk about the general characteristics that you can use within debates. And I would note that in terms of characterizing Mindanao and its people, I really would suggest that you take into account these characteristics. The first is that Mindanao is not a homogeneous group, meaning that there's no cohesive identity for people to strictly associate certain features to Mindanaoan only. Different regions have different identity based off of their development past, for example, from their pre-colonial effects up until now. There's also multitude of religions and ethnicities. So a lot of associations to Mindanao is that it is dominated by Muslims, which pre-colonially might be a fact, but this often erases the role of or the existence of Lumad groups within Mindanao. There's no regions that are purely Muslim or purely Christians, just majority living within that. And it's also important to point the Mindanao's tri-people paradigm, which has been used in our prayers, which has been used in our tourism campaign. But the Mindanao tri-people paradigm essentially just presents Mindanao as a home for people, Christians, Lumads, and then Muslims. But this ought to be challenged because this is rooted on homogenizing, and this is colonially rooted on settlement, and reducing people to certain groups, which is an attempt to erase the diverse identities of groups and people, and just an oversimplification of the identity. Even Lumads have different ethno-linguistic groups, such as I mentioned, Blaan, Tiboli, even the Bangsamoro. You have 13 ethno-linguistic groups, such as the Tausug, the Maranaos, and etc. So it's a disservice, and it's really an oversimplification to just categorize Mindanao's diversity into three general groups. The second is I want to note is that not all regions and areas in Mindanao are in conflict and in post-conflict situations, because a lot of times people is generalized Mindanao as a war-torn and dangerous areas, because it ignores the fact that not all regions historically were placed in situations of conflict. But also, secondly, even when the majority has experienced conflict, the nature of these conflict are usually varied. Huge effect to this is that, or the general characterizations that we can make on Mindanao identity, is that oftentimes, and for the vast majority of people, they share the same colonial history with Spaniards and Americans, but also they also share the marginalization and the discrimination that they have faced all throughout history up until now, but also of the deprivation of the services within Mindanao in general. And I want to note that when we're making general characterizations in debates, I think it would always help to have specific examples and to point out specific conditions, so that you do not have the mistake of overgeneralizing Mindanao. The next thing that I wanna discuss is this idea of land of promise, which is essentially a concept that we often hear in debates. But it's important to point out that this narrative is a colonial project. The land of promise, when Mindanao was called the land of promise, the promise was peace and progress, and it was made by the state, but it was just a strategy to integrate settlers and to reinforce the narrative of a nationhood that is built on external and colonial assumptions. So where it came from, a project and the propaganda collaborated by the United States that sees Mindanao as an unsettled frontier of lands that can be an opportunity for businesses and for settlements to thrive. These are also made more specifically by President Manuel L. Quezon during the various land programs, one of which was the National Land Settlement Administration, which just resettled landless farmers in Cotabato or Mindanao and other areas as well. But this was also intended to reinforce the Filipino identity and nationhood, this idea that we have a singular Filipino identity to unite our nation during the Commonwealth and after the war. So it treated non-Christians as minorities that needed to adapt to this national identity framework. And the way that they did that was through education and religion, and religion, specifically Catholicity, became the important feature from the Spanish colonization of evangelism up until that moment of assimilation. And the narrative was also reinforced during the Marcos Sr. regime in the guise of ensuring that there are peace and order in Mindanao when there was vast atrocities against Muslim and indigenous communities in Mindanao. It was employed in order to ensure that Mindanao is quote unquote in peace. The impact to this narrative was that it first again encouraged mass and state-sponsored settlement. So the conception that there were fertile lands and that there was vast opportunity for people to settle in despite the presence of already established sultanates and Lumad territories. But there was also an imposition of land laws, for example. And this is because the customary law or the adat among the Moros dictates that there can be no absolute ownership of the land because Islamic principles hold that land and all creation belong to God and that human beings are trustees only or stewards of God's creation. So among moral land holding was like based on the right to produce of the land. But then the strategy of the colonial government at that time was to automatically, if your land isn't registered, you become open for occupation and purchase by citizens of the Philippines and the United States. So this led to foreign plantations, for example, where native inhabitants became workers of their own land. But also since these are processes that are often complex, this gives out little accommodation to native inhabitants, which was different from Christian settlers, primarily the Visayans and the Ilocanos. They were given land and credit and access to state services, which are advantages that were not afforded to local Moros or Lumats. Uh, there are a couple of notes in order to conclude this section of the identity formation of Mindanao. In the picture here, you can see the conceptualization of the United States to what Mindanao is. And essentially, just this shows the diversity of ethno-linguistic groups living within Mindanao at that specific time. The first thing I want to note is that Mindanao identity is one that is imposed and not organic as we see it today. It was aimed to facilitate colonization towards native inhabitants, and this caused the marginalization of native inhabitants to become minorities to their own land. So We in debates we must be careful with associating characterizations that have been historically used to repress indigenous and native identities. A lot of how Mindanao is perceived is an external imposition of what it should be, even with the current characterizations and perceptions of what Mindanao is by Mindanaoans themselves may not necessarily reflect what Mindanao is. And there was a popular article even by Rappler here discussing about Duterte's appropriation and hijacking of Mindanao identity. There's a trend of appropriating struggles, but your lineage, for example, is not traced within native populations of Mindanao. For example, Duterte's lineage are from political families in Cebu, but he successfully co-opted that even there was a claim that he had Mindanao ancestry, which is false. But although this does not discount the narrative that, of course, the struggle of settlers who have come to experience the marginalization of Mindanao in general also exists. And then the third is that indigenous cultures are important feature in our discussion of Mindanao history. Mindanao history is not just about the Moro struggle. There's also equal importance to the stories of Lumads and their own struggles and responses to colonialism. And there's already a context of being a minority within a minority in this current political arrangement. But also lastly, I think if there's a light here, is that indigenous cultures as we see them now persisted. And this is an explicit expression of their resistance to colonial rule. The second section will talk about politics, peace, and security perspective. The issues of Mindanao peace and security and politics are often reflected in motions such as this House prefers a world where Mindanao developed to become an independent nation, or this House hopes for a Mindanao secession. Usually in these debates, the central issue is just the issue of autonomy. And usually how this is angled is in terms of the extent to which that autonomy is granted under the current Philippine bureaucracy, the Philippine devolution and decentralization, meaning the capacity of the bureaucracy to give room for local governments and regional governments to decide. There's an extent already of autonomy granted to everyone, even those regions outside of Mindanao, that allows a certain degree of autonomy, such as the delegation of national powers to certain regional agencies. But this is become insufficient because frameworks still tend to be top to bottom. For example, our education framework tends to be centralized at best and leaves no room to localization and adaptation based on local and regional realities. The major question within this debate is just a discussion of self-determination. So what I want to do is to discuss the reasons why this self-determination, this pursuit existed. And I can categorize it based on three subsections. The first is just in the history of annexation, because earlier we've discussed already how the Mindanao was only annexed by Spain to US without the consent of the social and political structures that has existed at that time. The Moros were integrated into these new political entities by force, which ultimately led to distrust, added to that the settlement. So there was alienation, and the Marinaos, for example, called the central government during that time as a government of foreigners, or locally gobierno as Sarwang Atao. So this is uh indication of the gap during that time with the national government to the institutions within Mindanao. The second reason for the pursuit of this self-determination was really just articulated during the or more specifically associated with the Bangsamoro struggle. So I want to first note that the Bangsamoro struggle is already established immediately even during the colonial time. There was already resistance to colonial rule. But it was not until the Jabida massacre which was the revolutionary movement became formalized by the Moro National Liberation Front, that this pursuit for self-determination was articulated. The Jabida massacre occurred during the 1960s, when at least 28 young Moro recruits of the Philippine Army were killed by their Christian superiors. It was in the island of Corregidor off of Luzon. So reports leaked out that the government was training these young men to infiltrate the Malaysian state of Sabah, or the North Borneo, which we know Philippines has claim on. So they want to train them as a prelude to military invasion. But when the recruits learned that they were fighting against their fellow Muslim brothers and sisters in Sabah, they rebelled. And this ultimately resulted in the massacre. There was only one survivor to tell the story. And as we know it today, that sparked the Bangsamoro pursuit for self-determination. And this resulted for the resurgence of the Islamic identity, who for the years before that had already been oppressed and continued to be marginalized from settlements and from the national and central government. This gave birth to the Mindanao, the Moro independence movement, which was the organization of young Muslim individuals who were sent into Malaysia. And then after their training, they organized the MNLF, and this was led by the leader of the MNLF, Nur Miswari. Nur Miswari was a former political science lecturer in the University of Philippines, Manila, and after the Jabida massacre, returned to Mindanao to organize the MIM. And the last reason is that generally and in modern times, you can associate this pursuit for self-determination because of the distance of the government institutions into these specific situations. So institutions are far from Mindanao. You have limited Mindanao senators, for instance, to represent their interests. Even with Mindanao senators, there's no assurance that Mindanao development agenda is on top of their political agenda. You have lack of representation, you have lack of public services, opportunities, and development initiatives as well. You have the disproportionate concentration of certain government industries, institutions in Metro Manila. You can only see limited of that in Mindanao. What does these reasons mean? Uh, this means that first, because these structures exist, the indifference and resentment bred out and led the connotation of the imperial Manila, and this has fueled populists. For instance, Duterte and other of those coming from Mindanao, uh, and this bred regionalistic attitude that there is us and there is the other, and that other has different lived realities and different experiences, and we ought to dissociate ourselves with these other individuals because these are those that benefit in our expense. They're also unable to relate with national political institutions. There has been this is precisely why the concession in BARM is that autonomous government with a different system, so you are able to relate and contextualize government institution based off of their historical and social cultural upbringing. But also, there's also heavy reliance to local politics in demographic participation. And this is a discussion about why political dynasties become an institution in Mindanao. There's also vulnerability to extremist and armed struggle because of that feeling of resentment, because of that feeling of neglect by the central government. But all these things paved the way for the creation of the Bangsamoro government. Now, the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao, I first want to discuss the structure and why the structure of government of BARM is different from the rest of us. And I think that these are important political developments that can help us understand overall the direction and progress of Philippine politics in general, because these are essentially new arrangements to our political system. The first being that this is an autonomous government. What that means is that there is power to govern by the BARM within its internal affairs. They can create their own laws. They can manage their own resources and develop policies for its people. There's a For the vast majority of other regions, there's a great dependency to the national government in terms of their funding. But what happens in BARM is that there is an automatic block grant that is given to BARM. And their budget, therefore, is not subject for congressional budget hearing and approval that we see in television. They are also empowered to enact their own laws, meaning that while others are bound to national legislation, they can have laws such as anti-political dynasty law, which we'll discuss later on. What parliamentary as a feature means is that they have a unicameral body. They In order to accommodate to a lot of major groups and prevent dominance of one, a parliamentary system is, I think, was the best fit for the regional government because it ensured party politics, but it ensured as well that we can accommodate different perspectives, especially since the Bangsamoro struggle was really born out of different perceptions of what self-determination would look like. Parliamentary means that the relationship of executive and legislative is also very close. The chief minister, which is the head of government in BARM, is from the political party who got the majority during the elections. There are it includes special geographic areas. These are areas that are not within the provinces of BARM but have voted through a plebiscite their inclusion to the autonomous region. So there are pockets of jurisdiction of BARM, even to those outside the geographically or mainland Bangsamoro region. Um, there's also I think most recently the Sulu's exit of BARM from a plebiscite, which necessarily the Tausugs voted that they would opt out in the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region, which has been ruled by the Supreme Court as valid. Um, in order to unpack that, there's a lot of nuances to it. But generally for BARM, I think the special features that is worth noting is in terms of their anti-political dynasty provision, which Congress even cannot do themselves. So by there's a provision in the electoral code that does not allow relatives by the second degree in the same level of government to be enacted. So it ensures that the nominees, particularly in the parliamentary elections, are not dominated by a political family, which was traditionally the case in the region. And what I think was the fall of the arms of the autonomous region for Muslim Mindanao, previously ARM. There's also a gender quota provision. What this provision meant is that in political parties, they will submit nominees, and based on the number of votes that they get is also the number of seats that they will assume in the parliamentary election. The gender quota provision compels the political parties to have 30% of their nominees to be women. So that means that out of 40 possible seats that a political party can get, there's a 12 seats there that should be held by women. This is a provision that is not existent even on our national political electoral framework. This is unique to BARM specifically because it's easier to enforce as a party politics centered political system. So it's hard to do that when in national elections, when we elect district representatives, for example, or we elect senators, for example. The nominees here may not necessarily suggest that they are the top nominees, so it doesn't ensure that they will be automatically elected in the government, because it also does not say that it should be the top 12, or so there's that the tendency that the nominees, the 12 of them will be the bottom 12 nominees, and it makes it unelectable if ever. There's also a discussion again of the party politics, which just means that there's a competition of political parties, which the Electoral Code has named genuinely principled political parties, because there are a lot of safeguards to these qualifications of political parties, regional political parties, for example, that the membership must be across all provinces and all jurisdiction, not just the specific provinces, but the membership stems from a lot of regions. There's also, again, the anti-political dynasty provision, but there's also a compelling requirement for political parties to make their own constitution, to make their own, to penalize those that have dual membership to political parties. So this can be a opportunity to kind of explore how we can penalize party turncoatism, which is prevalent in the national political landscape. And this just generally means that political parties are bound with principles. They must have a convention when they where they can discuss the ideologies or the program priorities of their regions. But what this does is that it just strengthens political parties, and it allows like out competition of one political party from another, institutionalizing and professionalizing the kind of politics and kind of competition that they have. The next section will talk about the economic perspective of the Mindanao situation. And these are generally can be encapsulated into two sections. The first is that conflict has affected the development of many Mindanaoan areas. As we know that peace is a prerequisite and a precondition to economic progress. That's the reason why for the vast majority development has lagged for Mindanao, because the business and investment opt-in has been low, particularly because of the conflicts. And the second is in terms of the opportunities and the wage gap that has been extensively different from the rest of the regions, particularly in the metros. You have very low wage gap. You have concentration of industries in metro cities that led to the vast labor migrations. That is the subject of conversations why a lot of provincial individuals go to Manila to find opportunities, because then again, the opportunities in Mindanao is limited and very, very low, and the quality of life as well it is relatively low compared to the metropolitan cities. The second is the kind of economy that Mindanao has is an extractive kind of community economy. What Mindanao industries become as a result of the land grabbing and as a result of history of assimilation and settlement is that the vast majority of lands, which has become plantations and which has become farms, for example, are something that is not owned by the native population. As a consequence of this occupation and land grabbing, industries become a component of the large economic system that just provides. So, for example, in terms of the issue of electrification, there's an opportunity for the electric grid of Mindanao to be connected with the Visayas and Luzon to add or to give supplies electricity, even though a lot of regions in Mindanao still do not have the capacity to be electrified. So this is just an indication of how not just extractive, but also of how this is only a component of the larger economic industry that often leaves Mindanaoans behind. And what I mean by extractive is that these industries are heavily resource extraction centric. You have mining of natural resources. You have a lot of logging industries in Mindanao. Against its forest, you have fisheries and agriculture, but most prominently, you have monocropping. You can associate certain regions or certain towns with a single crop. Davao being banana capital. You have Pulomulok being pineapple capital. You have our own town being a coconut capital. So the monocropping is so worse that it just becomes unsustainable and extractive at best. Question: can Mindanao independently stand on our own if we have this vast majority of resources? And the quick answer is no, because industries have become of service to national economic structure, that the kind of resources that we produce is no longer able to sustain all our needs. So the claims as to Mindanao providing a lot of resources is true, but standing on our own as a nation is untrue. So debates that usually we can integrate this discussion is, for example, just a motion on this house regrets the rapid urbanization in Mindanao. A lot of issues are centered in the question of whether the kind of development Mindanao has received throughout the years have been genuinely intended and contextualized for local needs. And this puts into question whether the kind of development, investment, and infrastructures that had happened in our society is something that is externally imposed without necessarily taking into account and consideration localized manners, for example, or identities. So there's entry of the market, for example, that has the tendency to commercialize indigenous communities and commodities. It also are businesses that often co-opt by political elites, for example. So the central issue usually is on the local displacement because of these developments, but also on the question of, is this development necessary, provided and given the kind of history and extreme marginalization for our region. So argumentation is the kind of development is not just necessarily for economic reasons, but one that also can respond to identity. Are the kind of industries we develop in line with our religious and cultural practices? Are the framework used in our education take into consideration identities, or is it an imposition again of a centralized curriculum? And then you accuse, for example, illiteracy and underdevelopment, which may and may not be true based on our current national standards. But it is precisely because the curriculum do not meet the context of these people. These are post-conflict. These are highly individuals that highly associate themselves with their religion and culture, that you also fail to make these curriculum effective to these children in the first place. So this is the end of my lecture. If you've reached this far, thank you so much for listening, and I hope that you take into account all the things that has been discussed when we're talking about Mindanao, or even just generally on Philippine politics in debate rooms. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful day.